I will never forget the first time I opened up TNO. It was release day. The Discord was abuzz with people celebrating the release of their long-anticipated mod. I'd heard about TNO, but I hadn't learned anything about its scenario beforehand. Seeing the excitement of all the Discord server was certainly promising to see, but the impact of hearing the Burgundian lullaby for the first time and seeing the loading screen quotes had etched into my mind a deep, dark world. Nazism had destroyed the world, with the Germans utterly dominating Europe. The British Isles were shattered, with Cornwall being a massive military base. The French were put into such a humiliating position by Himmler and the SS that the eastern portion of their capital had been occupied by them, as well as other large swaths of territory. The Japanese had succeeded in their ambitions to unite Asia, highlighted by the crimson red that has drenched nearly all the states in Asia. The most humiliating of it all is the Japanese annexation of Hawaii and the treaty ports that they had taken from America. A symbolic concession that marked the end of European imperialism and the victory of the Japanese. Africa has faced a radical reorganization, with half of the continent subjugated by the Germans. But not only that, the Congo River was dammed, flooding the entire system to create a massive lake, which was only one small part of Hermann Sorgel's plan to connect Africa and Europe, Atlantropa. After the Germans had utterly dominated all of Europe, they had constructed the Gibraltar Dam, allowing for an abundance of electricity and the introduction of new lands for the Mediterranean states to occupy. However, the reality is that these lands would be barely hospitable. The Sahara Desert would slowly expand into formerly fertile European lands, also the Germans could have cheap electricity. Soon, the once united Europe would break apart into two separate factions, the Einheit Pact and the Triumvirate. And due to the meddling of the SS, the German Reich would fall into a civil war. This vulnerability of the previously uncontested hegemon gives the Organization of Free Nations an incredible opportunity to oust the Germans from Africa. In 1963, South Africa would face insurrections. The Boers rise up and attempt to overthrow the Anglo, while the Africans of the state attempt to gain their own true freedom away from apartheid. The Americans put all their might into assisting the South Africans, leading to the war escalating to involve all the German colonies in Africa, who, without clear leadership from Germania, as 4 different Führers fight for the title, they need to band together and attempt to prevent their destruction. What would be known as the South Africa War would define American and German politics for the rest of the decade of TNO's gameplay, where even in the victories for either the OFN or the Einheit Pact, the future of Africa is uncertain. However, this entire dynamic is going to be removed. On July 25th, 2025, the TNO team had announced that they would be incorporating an in-development submod, which is sought to make the outcome of Africa more realistic. Thus, the iconic proxy war that enraptured all the hearts who'd played it is soon to die. This may seem surprising, but if you've been following TNO's development since the beginning, you would be aware that the German Civil War is being removed in favor of a death of Stalin-like power struggle, the Kazakhstani warlordism including Novopolska, and of course, the plausibility rework that started it all, the removal of Atlantropa. The previously iconic aspect of the mod, the first menu screen, and I argue the most obvious example of its subtitle, The Last Days of Europe, was removed following leadership changes away from a lead developer to a developer council. Since then, the community has been divided by those who happily accept the removal of unrealistic gameplay and lore elements to the scenario, and those who believe that the direction of attempting to be realistic has effectively destroyed TNO and what made it unique. While there are some who dislike the direction TNO has taken over the years, but still appreciates the removal of Atlantropa, I am firmly in the belief that Atlantropa was the soul of the New Order. In my Lore Grave videos, I talk about a core aspect of a mod, some special component that gives this project its own identity beyond its premise. Thousand Week Reich and the New Order are both Axis victory premises, but due to their cores, they're completely different. Thousand Week Reich is a great mod in its own right. It has a grounded scenario which allows for several different forms of gameplay. In comparison, TNO in its original form is extremely ungrounded, but once you tip your toes into the scenario as it plays out, you're exposed to a very elegant critique of Nazism as an ideology. The lore provides every possible advantage that the Nazis could have. An agrarian was the leader of the USSR, not a rapid industrializer. The entire British Navy was caught in the Mediterranean after the Spanish and Portuguese joined the Axis. Operation Sea Lion has succeeded. The Germans developed the nuke, and the Japanese allowed a German bomber to deploy it on Hawaii. Any alternate history content creator would tell you that all these points of divergences are ridiculous. Even in my How to Make Plausible Alternate History video, I advocate for a single point of divergence approach. My take on an Axis victory scenario may use a single implausible point of divergence, but it remains realistic enough to be believable. But in the case of the New Order, it was never the point. The entire point of the narrative was that even in the most optimal circumstances, Nazism as an ideology is so abhorrent that it would never achieve their ambitions. And just like how the lore of the scenario is unrealistic, so is Atlantropa. The ultimate symbol of German dominance, arrogance, and disregard for other nations. The developers had said in their defense of the removal that the continent for all of these Mediterranean nations would constantly be struggling to keep their economies afloat as the sinking seas and encroaching deserts threatened their states from falling into complete anarchy. And yet, this is the exact sort of content that I, and potentially many others, would be wanting to see. The scenario may be unrealistic, but by embracing it, we're able to explore an alternate reality that allows for ourselves to reflect on our own. The term alternate history on YouTube has a very different meaning than the normies may associate with. Whenever I tell people in real life that I do alternate history, they go, "Oh yeah, like the Amazon show Man in the High Castle?" And while many in our sphere of the internet can easily argue that this is the most implausible scenario that you could imagine, does this implausibility make it any less of an alternate history? No. Absolutely not. There are several pieces of art in the world right now that are all deserving of the title, even if they're not plausible, or even focus on the lore and background of the scenario itself. For example, The Handmaid's Tale is an alternate history. The premise of the show is that men had suddenly become extremely infertile due to environmental conditions, and that the theonomic state of Gilead had forced fertile women to become servants of the ruling classes to propagate themselves. You could argue that this is unrealistic or implausible, but without the implausibilities, we don't get to explore the extremes of American Christian fundamentalism, nor the themes of women empowerment. If TNO keeps removing their implausible elements, what sort of stories would they be able to tell? What sort of stories would they eliminate in exchange for new ones? The German Civil War was such an iconic part of the mod, and soon is going to be removed and replaced with an internal political struggle. The developers have stated that this is because the German Reich would not be able to compete with the Japanese or Americans if they had faced a civil war. And yet, I would already push back on this. The absolute horror of the Germans being capable of destroying the world if threatened, despite their state equating to a rotting corpse, is peak horror. Will the corpse collapse onto the button and destroy the world? Or will the two competing superpowers prevent its collapse, to at least prevent their mutual destruction? But back to the Civil War. The 4 different successors of Hitler that you can choose each represent their own aspect of the Nazi regime that people either praise or blame for all of its failures. Bormann represents the Nazi Party, Speer represents the pragmatic technocrats, Göring represents the military, and Heydrich represents the SS. The German Civil War's violent nature allows for these 4 factions to have completely eliminated the other 3, allowing for the writers to go deep into each aspect of the complex, draconian regime that was Hitler's Germany. Heydrich's path is extremely well done, and we'll talk about it soon. But besides Göring's path being mostly oriented towards conquest, Speer and Bormann's paths are both equally good narratives. Speer's balancing act between using the Gang of Four to consolidate his regime and the Gang of Four using Speer to slowly phase out the Nazi Party from their one-party state dictatorship allows for a very interesting scenario, but an extremely bleak one in the case of Speer becoming the uncontested Führer. In contrast, Bormann's path was meant to represent that the hard-headedness of the party and its bureaucracy would contribute to a gradual stagnation of the Reich. The gameplay is intentionally extremely frustrating to manage as you attempt to wrangle the bureaucracy of the House of Cards, before eventually resolving to eliminate all of your rivals through force. But a second Knight of the Long Knives won't save you when there's no more loyal members of your party, and a second German Civil War in the 70s could be on the horizon. Unfortunately, we'll never get to see that sort of outcome for Bormann's Germany. Instead, the new updates for Bormann will have him being equally as reformist as Speer. And yeah, of course, maybe he would be reformer. He would need to be a reformer in order for Germany to be stable enough to be able to compete against the two world powers, but are you seeing the problem? There's a core aspect to this entire scenario, the narrative that laid behind it, that's being destroyed for the sake of something else. That something else may be amazing. We don't know. By pursuing realism over reinforcing the established narratives and themes, they are actively diminishing the impact of the stories that the mod contains, all before they remove it and all before they replace it with something else. And while I have no doubt that the TNO team is competent at creating good content, nothing will ever beat the perfection of Heydrich's path for me. When I played the Heydrich path, I cried several times over. The slow descent into madness of Heydrich as he begins to face the purest form of National Socialism, the Brigadian system and their global plans, the nuclear annihilation of the entire world besides the select few Aryans, invoked such raw emotion in me. There was betrayal, disgust, horror, and yet a very small sliver of hope. I had endlessly tried to get as many SS statelets to my side of the grand showdown with Himmler, and every time I failed, the entire world was destroyed. Despite the stakes never being higher, I kept pushing on until I had finally put an end to the Ordenstaat. And yet, that glimmer of hope was a false one. Soon after the Civil War is won, Heydrich realizes there's no redemption for him and he commits suicide. Afterwards, yet a third civil war emerges in Germany, ultimately leading to the state falling to pure anarchy. But even worse, in my game, Himmler had still won. His global plan of instigating conflict between the USA and Japan had succeeded, and soon after American troops had landed on Japanese soil, the entire world was destroyed by nuclear fire anyway. This ending was so perfect, it's my canon TNO ending, the ultimate culmination of bleak hope of the crushing reality of a war between states in a nuclear age, and the utter destruction of the National Socialist ideology. But this ending, the conflict between Himmler and Heydrich, even the entire story of Burgundy and their global plan to induce nuclear war is going to be gone. The most tragic yet beautiful story I've ever seen is going to go away. The Heydrich path could have been turned into its own standalone novel and been a respectable work of fiction, and yet it was instead depicted in a World War II simulator game. Why would they do this? Whenever I introduced anybody to TNO, I would always tell them the following guidelines. Read every event, every focus description, and every decision. Whenever you find yourself skimming over this content, save your progress and enter again at a later point. This is because I firmly believe TNO was always meant to be designed as a visual novel, rather than a Cold War or World War III simulator. But if that's the case, then why was TNO ever depicted in Hearts of Iron 4? There's a concept in media nowadays that the medium is the message. Put simply, the way that art is manifested has more of an impact, or potentially all the impact, of a piece of art. In the case of the New Order, the mod is built off of a World War II simulation game. And yet, if you elect to play the game the way that you normally would, the game punishes you by annihilating the entire world in a nightmare-inducing sequence that removes all playable nations, leaving only few rare events that detail the consequences of their post-apocalyptic society. The decision to implement such a cinematic experience into the gameplay is what makes TNO so unique. If I recall correctly, there used to be no limits on if or when a world war would begin between the major powers of the world when the game first released. This had meant that if you were playing a Russian warlord attempting to unify your country again, your entire campaign would be ended by the chafing of the world powers. Having a game end only for reasons outside of your control is not very good game design, but that's only if you're trying to make a World War II or World War III simulator scenario. Before I became the LoreDad, I was a game designer. When I was first learning, I asked my senior what sort of feeling I should be going for when designing mechanics. He told me that it's completely up to me. While the correct answer should have been engagement and excitement given what we were working on, he decided to answer it generally. That frame of mind helped me understand that game design can be just as much of a creative art form as the visuals or audio of a game. A perfect example of this principle are games that defy the genre that they're advertised as. Spec Ops: The Line may appear like a general Call of Duty style shooter game that glorifies violence, but as the game progresses, you're forced to participate in atrocities to progress the story. It puts the entire world, the entire genre of video games that you like to consume into context. Therefore, the deliberate decision to make your game, the story that you've spent hours of time into, getting invested in the characters, mastering the game mechanics, could all be removed by a random percentage chance that the AI picked the wrong options in the event chain, is a brilliant decision to demonstrate the horror of this scenario and even our real life. Eventually, this decision to allow for the game to end outside of the player's control was removed. The gameplay experience of the New Order became far less frustrating, but by removing this element of the game, did it destroy the artistic message of the New Order? There's a thought experiment known as the Ship of Theseus, where the same ship would be repaired over and over every year. Eventually, all the original parts of the ship that had been worn down were replaced. But the question is this ship still Theseus' ship? If it wasn't, when did it stop being Theseus' ship? This philosophical question has many answers and many different versions. I'd like to propose my own version, Theseus' mod. If a Hearts of Iron 4 releases an update that replaces old content, is it still the same mod? What if the same mod had released a different update, but they just removed aspects of the mod? Is that mod still the same? There have been many cases of fan forks of original mods that become their own unique experiences, like how Kaiser Redux had split off from Kaiserreich, or how old Führerreich had been developed to the point where it didn't resemble the version that people had originally loved, which led to their Redux dropping the Redux and just being Führerreich. In this case, is the former Redux Führerreich the same Führerreich? And finally, the New Order. If the developers remove Atlantropa, Brittany, Large Burgundy, esoteric Nazism, the West African War, the Congo Lake, and soon, the German Civil War, is that version of the mod still the New Order? And if it isn't, when did it stop being the New Order? Much like the original paradox, there are many different answers to this last case, but my answer should be obvious. After they removed Atlantropa, it stopped being the New Order. By doing so, it had lost its soul and stopped being the same mod, and I don't think people should be shamed for thinking and feeling this way. But the opposite is also true. If people genuinely like this version of the mod, this repaired, reworked, and more plausible TNO, they shouldn't be shamed for it either, nor the people making it. At the end of the day, TNO and what it's supposed to be can never truly be defined when it's so subjective. And even if you choose to disagree with the TNO developers, it's fully in their right to take the direction that they choose. If you disagree with the TNO team's direction, I would advise you to consider supporting a fan fork instead of complaining to the developers. What I have hoped to accomplish with this video is to encourage people not to be afraid of being creative with their alternate histories. If you are deliberately seeking plausibility, and you have the Gibraltar Dam drying up the Mediterranean within half of a decade, then you should probably consider pushing it back because that's physically impossible. If you're seeking a realistic scenario, your alternate history would not have happened. Just read a history book. But if you're seeking to establish a setting for a greater story, in which to use things like the Atlantropa project as a symbol of German arrogance, you should be free to do so without fear, nor should anyone ridicule you for embracing your creativity. I say this in all of my videos, but please do not harass the TNO developers. Whatever they do is completely up to them. It's their project, they put in the labor, they've made all this work, and they're putting it out for us to enjoy. That's still 100% true. But I'm also very sick and tired of people just dismissing the critiques that this direction is flawed. Thank you for listening to my first video essay. If you have any feedback on this kind of video approach, please let me know in the comments. Shout out to Grud, Jubs, Louis Avant, Cindy Beatty, and Seeking Sentience for being channel members. Thank you so much for your support. If you want to have your name shouted out at the end of my video, please consider supporting the channel by getting a membership. Don't shame people for being creative, and I hope you have a good day.